Hello, ladies. My name is Jennifer, and I'm a Christian. I don't claim any other name but that of Christ, so I'm just a Christian, and this is Women of the Word. And it's a Bible study for women dealing with issues affecting women. I'd like to begin with a prayer. Dear Lord, please bless those who are participating in this study. Let it bring fruit to their lives and glory to your name. I'd like to give a special request for all those in medical and emotional pain at this time. In Jesus Christ's name I pray. Amen. Okay, so last week we took a look at what the Bible says about itself, that it claims that it's from God. And so this week we're going to take a look at some of the proofs for that. So it claims that it's from God, and we showed that last week. But just because you say something doesn't mean that it's true. I could say I am the President of the United States. But of course there's absolutely no proof of that. Mostly because it's not true. And that's a thing that you can always count on, is that things that are true should be provable. Alright, so how do you prove that the Bible is the truth? How do you prove that it's truly from God? It should be able to do things that a human book can't. It should be able to do things that you can't do without God. Now we're going to look today at pre-scientific knowledge. That the Bible makes statements that we discovered later through scientific inquiry were true. They had not discovered these things when those statements were written. Okay? So, we're going to look at a couple of realms on that. We're going to look at the natural world. We're going to look at the health laws of Moses. And we're going to look at the dietary laws of Moses. There's some crossover in that, but we're going to look at some specifics. So, in the natural world, what we're going to look at first, we're looking at the water cycle. Okay? That's how we get rain, and how the ocean gets rain, and how that all fits together. So what did the Bible say? In Ecclesiastes chapter 1 verse 7, it states, "All the rivers run into the sea, yet the sea is not full. To the place from which the rivers came, there they return again." Okay. Ecclesiastes 11:3 says, "If the clouds are full of rain, they empty themselves upon the earth." And then later, in Amos chapter 9 verse 6, it states, "He who built his layers in the sky and has founded his strata in the earth and pours them out on the face of the earth, the Lord is his name." That last one is the most interesting. So the first two, you can almost guess just by looking. We observe that the rivers run to the sea. And we see the clouds pour out their water on the earth. You could make a logical jump to say that somehow the clouds must come from the sea. And it would all make sense. But the layers in the atmosphere, where would they get that idea? So you look down further, And what science says is all rivers run into the sea, but the water will return to the place that it came from. It does this by becoming clouds and raining. It evaporates from the sea to form the clouds, and the clouds rain on the earth. And the rain all runs into the streams and rivers and then back into the sea in an endless cycle. Sometimes that cycle gets interrupted, but that's another conversation. And that there are layers in the atmosphere, such as the stratosphere. And this is provable through the use of satellites. We didn't have satellites until last century. Okay, so what else are we going to look at? The division of light. That's how when light goes through something, it splits up into a rainbow. So what the Bible said is in Job chapter 38, verse 24. It says, "By what way is light diffused?" The King James Version of the Bible says, "By what way is the light parted?" So, diffused, parted, divided. Okay, oops, I'm trying to use the mouse instead of the keyboard, sorry. What science says is when light passes through a prism, and water drops form a prism, it'll divide into the many colors of light. And Isaac Newton discovered this in 1666. That verse is from Job, and Job was actually the oldest book written chronologically. It's not the first one in the Bible, as far as the way they're printed, but it's the oldest one. Because they're not arranged that way. They're not arranged by how old they are. They're arranged topically. Next we have the paths of the sea. And this is almost a throwaway line, but it actually launched an entire field of science. In Psalm chapter 8, verse 8, it says, "And the fish of the sea that pass through the paths of the sea." So there was a gentleman by the name of Matthew Fontaine Maury. He found and mapped the geography and weather of the oceans. 1855. This is before we had any real submarines, so that was a really fantastic accomplishment of his. But he did it because of that verse. And of course, someone who would follow him back into the 20th century was Jacques Cousteau. And he made an even bigger accomplishment there. And of course, later satellites again would help to really visualize that. You look at Google Maps or Google Earth today, and you can really see that. But just based on what information they had, they were able, even in 1855, to prove that. Okay, now let's take a look at King David, the house of David. So, what the Bible said is pretty much the entire book of 2 Samuel. 1 Samuel is about Samuel himself, how he came up in the world. It talks about the fact that he was the kingmaker. Israel didn't want to be ruled by judges anymore. They wanted a king like everybody else had. So Samuel, who was the judge, went to God and says, "What do I do?" He says, "Go ahead. There's rules in the law about how to do that. Give them a king. This is who I want you to give them." And it was Saul. Saul messed up very badly, and God took the line away from him. The next king that Samuel chose was a shepherd boy named David. And the story you're looking for is David and Goliath. He took a sling, which is a shepherd's weapon, and 5 smooth round stones, and he met the giant Goliath. Well over 9 feet tall, but he was a warrior, so he was well built, and probably could have turned David into Play-Doh, if you think about it. But he killed him, and he buried his head in a place called Golgotha, the place of the skull. But in 2 Samuel, this is when he actually came to the throne, because they weren't going to just knock Saul out of the way. They had to allow him to pass on before they put a new king on the throne. Once that happened, it was David who took over. And that story is in 2 Samuel. Now, for the longest time, archaeologists thought that David was a myth. But in 1993, at a site called Tel Dan, Tel is a hill, it just means hill or mound. They found a stela, which is a clay cylinder. It was commemorating the victory of an Aramean king over the king of Israel and the king of the house of David. Until this, like I said, they thought it was a myth. But then there's this other king says, nope, and I beat one of them. Now, of course, house of means the family of. So it wasn't David himself, but for there to be a house of David, there had to have been a David. But scholars now believe that this was the victory of Hazael of Damascus over Jehoram of Israel and Ahaziah of Judah during the time of the divided kingdom. And that would be in 2 Kings 12, verses 17 and 18, that mention that victory. And it's that happens a lot. People say, no, you'll never find evidence of this, it's not true. And then somebody does. The history of archaeology is peppered with such things. I keep doing that and grabbing the mouse. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get into the health laws. One of the laws was that every male child who was born alive, once they became 8 days old, would be circumcised. Now, ladies, if you're young ladies and have not yet met a man, you may not know what that means. Ask an older lady, because we're not going to talk about it on YouTube. I will go as far as the Bible does and say that they were cut in the flesh of their foreskin. So, and they did it on the 8th day. So what the Bible says is that, let's see, there's 2 of them. First is Genesis chapter 17, verse 12, and this was to Abram, who later became called Abraham. And it said, he who is 8 days old among you shall be circumcised, every male in your generations, he who is born in your house or bought from any foreigner who is not your descendant. So, if they're going to be a part of your house, whether they're from your line or from outside, circumcised 8 days and up. They preferred to do it on the 8th day, but if you brought an adult in, he would also have to be circumcised. Then later, this got repeated once the actual law of Moses came into effect, because of course Abraham is Moses' ancestor. And that would be in Leviticus 12 verse 3. And on the 8th day, the flesh of his foreskin shall be circumcised. Now, why the 8th day? Everywhere in the Bible is full of sevens. 7 is how creation took 6 days, and then on the 7th day he rested. He made that day holy. He made it set aside to celebrate the fact that the work of creation was done. And so it became a number of completeness and celebration and remembrance. So why the 8th day? It's out of place. And it didn't make sense. People wondered, of course. There's a lot of medical investigation done in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. They were still learning how the body was put together at that point. What they found was very interesting. They were starting to postulate the existence of a clotting enzyme. Because it turns out that sometimes, especially on day 7, if a boy got cut, he'd bleed out. Something was wrong that he was missing. They couldn't figure out what it was. So there's something that he's missing, that his blood's not clotting. So there must be an enzyme that does that. And that theory came around in 1872 by Alexander Schmidt. That enzyme was called prothrombin, and they found it in 1894. A man named Peckel Harding. I don't have a first name on him. All I found was Peckel Harding. So, if you can find that first name, go ahead and drop that in the comment box for me. I would love to know the answer to that. Now, since 1961, American Academy of Pediatrics has recommended as standard practice the administration of a shot of vitamin K, which is essential for prothrombin production. And that was what was wrong with those boys. About 1 in every 200 will not have enough, especially on day 7. When it's at 75%. About 75%. On day 8, it's 125% of the amount that you'll have as an adult. So by doing it on day 8, you have more of that clotting factor available, even if you're not quite making enough vitamin K, that you are far more likely to survive surgery. Which is what circumcision is. It's surgery. So, because, you're going to bleed. The only way for someone in Moses' day to have done that, to know that, would have been to actually do it to hundreds and hundreds of babies. They didn't have the information. In the 19th and 20th century, they started to have microscopes. They could see this stuff. They didn't have that in Moses' time. Microscopy was required for this discovery. Pardon me. With the level being highest on the 8th day was also discovered in a series of steps that came between 1912 and 1935. 1961 is just when it became standard practice to fix it. All right, the disposal of human waste. Yes, we have a poop question. So, what does the Bible say about the disposal of human waste? It says bury it. Deuteronomy 23, 12 through 14. Also, you shall have a place outside the camp where you may go out, and you shall have an implement among your equipment, a shovel, and when you sit outside, you shall dig with it and turn and cover your refuse. Dig hole, cover it up. For the Lord your God walks in the midst of your camp to deliver you and give your enemies over to you. Therefore your camp shall be holy, that he may see no unclean thing among you, and turn away from you. So there's that. Nobody wants to see that, least of all him. But also, this makes sense from a modern sanitation standpoint. What science says is the Black Plague killed 13 million people in the Middle Ages. It was spread by fleas on rodents, which were attracted by the human and animal waste in the streets. Because people in the Middle Ages were gross. Cholera continues to kill 28 to 130,000 people every year. Every year. Because they don't keep it out of the water. It's spread through water contaminated by human waste. Other diseases spread this way include diarrhea, which is different than diarrhea. Diarrhea is a symptom. Diarrhea is an actual disease. Dysentery, hepatitis A, typhoid, and polio. Not fun. All of these diseases can be controlled and mitigated by proper disposal of human waste and keeping it out of the streets and out of the water supply. All of them. And they're not the only ones. There's other stuff out there. So just this is duh to us. Because we live in the age of microscopy. We know what germs are and that they cause disease. But that stuff they didn't know. They did not know this stuff back then. They just knew God didn't want to see it. And nobody blamed him. Alright, now we're going to get into the importance of blood. Another thing that microscopy discovered for us. There's a neat piece of American history in this one. So, what did the Bible say? In Leviticus 17, verse 11. It said, "For the life of the flesh is in the blood." So that made it, for ceremonial purposes, very important when you're talking about sacrifices. Without blood, there is no there's no relief from sin. A price has to be paid. I chooses blood because that's what life is. What does science say about the importance of blood? To the human body or animal bodies, it wasn't discovered by medical science until microscopy in the 1800s. And until this time, bloodletting was often prescribed to balance the humors, a practice common since the 1st century. This is what killed George Washington. He had a he was sick, probably had the flu. And they prescribed bloodletting. They basically made a cut in the elbow and let blood out, attempting to balance the humors. You can look up those practices. But he's sick already, and then he starts losing blood, and so he died. I know this was fairly common. There are medical leeches, but they're carefully controlled. They're fed good things that are free of diseases, and it's usually about removing infection today. And it's, like I said, it's very tightly controlled. It's not the witch doctors anymore. Alright, now we're going to get into the dietary laws in the Old Law of Moses. Animals that have died of natural causes or predation. Predation meaning wolves or any predator kills something. Can you steal their kill? And the answer is no. What the Bible had to say about that is found in Leviticus 17, verse 15. There's a lot of Leviticus in this, but again, we're looking at the laws of Moses, and that's why. It said, and every person who eats what it died naturally, or what was torn by beasts, he shall both wash his clothes and bathe in water, and be unclean until evening. So, what did science have to say about that? Since the advent of microbiology, we have known that eating such animals is dangerous because of the germs that may be harbored in their carcasses. And this just makes common sense. Predators kill the weak and sick animals first. So eating what they grabbed is probably not smart. And again, you find it dead on its own. Right now we have this thing in the United States that we're worried about, the zombie deer disease. Don't eat any deer that you find dead on the side of the road. You don't know if it had that. And this is why. We don't do that. Okay. The divided hoof and chew the cud. So, if an animal had a divided foot, it had to both have a divided hoof and chew the cud. So, a camel has toes instead of hooves. It doesn't have a hoof, but it chews the cud, so they wouldn't eat that. And it go further on the other side, and you have the pig. Has a split hoof, but does not chew the cud. So you don't eat pork if you are Jewish. If you are under the old law of Moses. And that is in Leviticus 2:6. Among the animals, whatever divides the hoof, having cloven hooves and chewing the cud, that you may eat. So that's your beef. Sheeps, goats, they do both. And then it goes through a lot of things that you shouldn't be eating. And the swine, though it divides the hoof, having cloven hooves, yet does not chew the cud, it is unclean to you. I skipped a bit just because we're wanting to get to the point of the pig. What does science say about that? Uncooked pork. Very, very high in parasitic in entities. Trichinosis is the big one with pigs, actually. And they wouldn't have known. One of the best ways to eat meat is to leave that a little bit pink on the inside, so it's nice and juicy and tender. You can't do that with pork. Period. Don't do it with pork. And they wouldn't have known that. So just avoid pigs altogether. They wouldn't even touch them. Which, to be honest, they wallow in their own mess. So that's also another reason. But moving on to bats. You weren't allowed to eat bats under the old law. Why is in the Bible? Leviticus 11, verses 13 through 19. And these you shall regard as an abomination among the birds. Now, birds meant anything that flies and is not a bug. Or that has feathers. Whether it's flies or doesn't. Ostriches are included on this list. Okay? So, they shall not be eaten, they are an abomination. The eagle, the vulture, the buzzard. I thought those were the same thing. The kite, the falcon after its kind, every raven after its kind, the ostrich, the short-eared owl, the seagull, and the hawk after its kind, the little owl, the fisher owl, and the screech owl, the white owl, the jackdaw. I had to look that one up. It's a little black bird. They're actually relatives of crows and ravens. The carrion vulture, the stork, the heron after its kind, the hoopoe, and the bat. It doesn't say why. It just says don't eat it. But what does science say? Bats can host over 100 different viruses and not get sick. They'd be fluttering around. They have these viruses and you will not know it because they don't get sick from them. It's about something about body chemistry or body temperature, depending on which one. And they have very good immune systems. It does not get to them, but they'll carry them. One of the main viruses that are so dangerous with bats is rabies. Almost every known case in the last 100 years in the United States of humans getting rabies came from bats. They had contact with a bat. It didn't come from Old Yeller. It came from a bat. What probably happened is Old Yeller, the coyote that he got a hold of, had gotten into a bat. That's where he got it. Another one is Ebola. They're pretty certain that the monkeys that they had been eating had gotten into bat caves on the Ebola River. And that's how that got started. So, again, these are things that the Israelites had no way of knowing. Science had not caught up. You don't eat a bat because God said not to. Now we know bats will give you rabies, bats will give you Ebola. But we didn't know that then. Absolutely. And they had no way of knowing without God saying it. And we have fins and scales. This one's kind of fun. What do you know about fins and scales? It has to have both. What the Bible said in Leviticus 11, verse 9 through 12. These you may eat of all that are in the water. Whatever in the water has fins and scales, whether in the seas or in the rivers, that you may eat. But all that is in the seas or the rivers that do not have fins and scales, all that move in the water or any living thing which is in the water, they are an abomination to you. There's a lot of territory in that. They couldn't eat turtles. Turtles have salmonella. They couldn't eat shellfish. When you're preparing fish, there's an entire course you have to take about shellfish. Plus, there are many that are poisonous. The South Sea cone shell is the source of one of the most dangerous neurotoxins on the planet. And then there's the fugu pufferfish. It's illegal for the Japanese emperor to eat fugu because it could kill him. It probably should just be illegal anyway, but that's my own opinion. And of course, the U.S. Navy Book on Survival on Land and Sea says most fish that have, and any fish that has poisonous flesh doesn't have normal scales. They will have spikes, spines, skin. Sharks are covered in this because they have skin, along with dolphins and whales and the other mammals, the sea otters and seals and sea lions, manatees. It's an interesting group of things that they're not allowed to eat out of the water. Sea snakes. They don't have fins. And there's a lot of them that are poisonous. The water has a lot of very dangerous things in it. So there are lots of reasons for this particular rule. So what are we going to conclude from all this? There's no way that these people had the scientific information that we do now. We can prove these things now because of our technology level. Their technology level was bows, arrows, and chariots. That's where they were at. The Egyptians were famous for their medical ability, but some of their recipes were very, very off and would get you malpractice today. So we have to conclude that when those mistakes didn't make it into the Bible, and Moses was from Egypt, he was raised in Egypt, he was educated by the Egyptians, but he didn't make those mistakes. And the only reason that I could think of would be divine intervention. So, next week we are going to be looking at some more information along these lines. We're going to be looking at prophecies. We're going to be looking at ethics. And there was one other thing, and I'd have to go look. But we're going to have some more proof that God wrote the Bible through the hands of men. So I will see you next week, Monday at 6:30 p.m. for Women of the Word.